I turned 87 this spring. At this age, most people assume there's nothing left to hide. They think the old eventually tell the truth about everything, as if age itself loosens the tongue, but that isn't always how it works. For most of my life, I've been known as a devoted husband, 62 years of marriage, 2 children, 4 grandchildren, a quiet house in the same town where my wife and I first met. People look at us and see something steady, something that lasted, and in many ways it did. My wife still sits by the same window every morning, drinking her tea slowly, the way she's done for decades. Sometimes she looks at me with the same soft eyes she had when we were young, the kind of eyes that trust you completely. That's the part that makes this so difficult, because the truth about our marriage, the real truth, isn't something I ever told her. Not when we were young and hopeful, not when we were raising children, not even when life started running out of time, and now, at 87 years old. There's something about that truth that keeps me awake most nights, especially because of what happened on a quiet evening in 1968. I met my wife, Eleanor, in the autumn of 1961. I was 22 years old, fresh out of the army, still trying to figure out what kind of man I was supposed to become. Back then our town was small enough that most people knew each other by name, but Eleanor was new. She had just started working at the town library, a quiet brick building that smelled like dust and old paper. The first time I saw her, she was standing on a ladder, trying to reach a book on the top shelf. Her dark hair had fallen loose from the clip at the back of her head, and she kept blowing it out of her eyes while balancing the book against her shoulder. I remember thinking she looked like someone who belonged in a photograph from a magazine. Graceful. The kind of woman who seemed certain about where she was going in life. I, on the other hand, had no idea. I walked up to the desk with a book I had no intention of reading, just so I'd have a reason to talk to her. When she looked up, she smiled politely and asked if I needed help finding something. I told her I already had. It was a terrible line. Even at 22 I knew that. But she laughed anyway, the kind of laugh that felt warm instead of mocking. That was the beginning. Back then, the world moved slower. We didn't rush things the way people seem to now. Our courtship was simple. I picked her up on Friday evenings in my old blue Chevrolet. The radio barely worked, so most of the time we drove in comfortable silence through the country roads outside town. Sometimes we went to the diner near the railroad tracks. Sometimes we walked along the river while the street lights flickered on. Eleanor had a way of listening that made you feel like your words actually mattered. I told her things I had never told anyone. About the nights in the army when I couldn't sleep. About the uncertainty I felt coming home, watching other men step into their futures while I still felt like a stranger in my own life. She never tried to fix any of it. She just listened. 6 months later, I asked her to marry me. I didn't even have a proper ring yet. I was standing outside her apartment building after walking her home, the cold air turning our breath into little clouds between us. My hands were shaking so badly I had to shove them into my coat pockets. She noticed, of course. Eleanor noticed everything. "Arthur," she said softly, "what's wrong?" I remember looking at her and realizing something that scared me more than anything else. I needed her. Not in the dramatic way people talk about love in movies. It was quieter than that, but it felt permanent. So I asked her, right there under the dim porch light, with cars passing slowly down the street and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the air. And she said yes. We married the following summer in a small church just outside town. My parents sat in the front row. Her sister traveled from Ohio to attend. The ceremony was simple, but I still remember how Eleanor looked walking down the aisle. Like the future had finally arrived. The early years of our marriage were good ones. Not perfect, but steady. I found work at a manufacturing plant that built farm equipment. The hours were long, but the pay was enough to rent a small house near the edge of town. Eleanor filled that house with warmth. She planted flowers along the front porch. She kept books stacked on every table. On Sunday mornings she made pancakes while humming softly to herself. Those are the memories people see when they look at our life together. And to be fair, those memories are real. Our first child, Daniel, was born 3 years later. I remember holding him in the hospital room, terrified that I might somehow drop him. Eleanor watched me with that same patient smile she always had, like she trusted me to learn how to be a father even before I believed it myself. 2 years after that, our daughter Rebecca arrived. By then our house felt full. Toys on the living room floor. Crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator. The sound of Eleanor reading bedtime stories from the hallway. If someone had asked me then, I would have said I was the luckiest man alive. But life has a way of introducing small cracks before anyone notices the damage. The plant where I worked began expanding in the late 60s. With the expansion came longer hours, more responsibility, and a supervisor who believed that loyalty to the company should come before everything else. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself I was working hard for my family, for Eleanor, for the children. But the truth is, something else began to happen during those years. I started staying later at work. At first it was just paperwork or extra shifts. But over time the plant became a place where I could escape the quiet expectations waiting at home. Eleanor never complained. That was the strange part. When I walked through the door late at night, she would still be awake, sitting in the living room with a book in her lap. She'd look up and ask how my day was, as if waiting for me had been the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes I wondered if she sensed the distance growing between us. But if she did, she never said it. In 1968, the company hired several new employees during the expansion. One of them was a woman named Margaret Collins. Margaret worked in the office just down the hall from mine. She was younger than Eleanor by a few years, sharp-minded and quick with conversation. The kind of person who could turn an ordinary afternoon into something lively without even trying. At first, she was just another coworker. We shared a few conversations near the coffee machine. Talked about work schedules, the weather, The usual things people say to fill empty moments. Nothing important. Or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. But sometimes life changes in ways that feel small at the beginning. A conversation that lasts a little longer than it should. A laugh that lingers in your mind during the drive home. You don't recognize the danger right away. And in those early days, I certainly didn't. Because if I had understood where those simple conversations would eventually lead, I might have walked out of that office building much sooner. Especially on the evening in 1968 when Margaret asked if I could stay a little later to help her finish something after everyone else had gone home. The evening Margaret asked me to stay late, the plant had already begun to quiet down. Machines that usually roared all day were falling silent one by one, and the long hallway outside the offices echoed with the hollow sound of footsteps as workers headed home. I should have left with them. Eleanor was probably already setting the dinner table. Daniel would be asking if we could play catch after supper. Rebecca would be dragging her stuffed rabbit across the living room carpet. That was my life. But when Margaret leaned into my office doorway and said she needed help finishing some reports, I told myself it would only take a few minutes. That's how these things begin. The office lights were dimmer after most people left. The building felt different when it wasn't full of noise and movement. Margaret sat across from me at the desk, flipping through stacks of paperwork while we talked about ordinary things. Her hometown, the music she liked, how strange it felt to move somewhere new where no one knew you yet. She had a way of talking that pulled you in. She listened closely, the same way Eleanor once had when we first met. I didn't notice the comparison forming in my mind at first. But it was there. That night we worked longer than expected. By the time we finished, the parking lot outside was almost empty. Margaret looked at her watch and laughed softly. "Looks like we're the last ones," she said. I nodded, gathering my coat, suddenly aware that I had stayed much later than I planned. We walked out together. The night air was cool, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. For a moment we stood beside our cars, neither of us speaking. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You must have a patient wife." It wasn't accusatory. If anything, it sounded thoughtful. But the words landed somewhere deep in my chest. I shrugged and said Eleanor was used to my work hours. Margaret studied me for a second, then gave a small smile before getting into her car. I drove home feeling strangely unsettled. Eleanor was exactly where I expected her to be, sitting in the living room chair with a book resting in her lap. When she heard the door open, she looked up and smiled the same warm smile she had given me thousands of times before. "Long day?" she asked. Said yes. And that should have been the end of it. But over the next few months, those late evenings at work became more common. Sometimes it was real work. Sometimes it was simply Margaret and me talking long after everyone else had left. At first, our conversations were harmless. We talked about books she was reading, old movies she loved, childhood memories that made her laugh. She had an energy that made the long workdays feel lighter. Meanwhile, life at home continued exactly as it always had. Eleanor kept the house warm and steady. The children grew taller every month. Our routine stayed the same: dinner at the table, quiet evenings, Sunday mornings at church. Nothing about my life looked broken, but something inside me had begun to drift. I noticed it one evening while watching Eleanor fold laundry at the kitchen table. She moved calmly, carefully smoothing each shirt before stacking it neatly. She looked peaceful, and for some reason, instead of comfort, I felt a strange restlessness. It shames me to admit that now, because Eleanor had done nothing wrong. Not once. Still, the pull of something new, something exciting, began to whisper in the back of my mind. Margaret and I started going for coffee after work once in a while. Just a quick stop at the diner before heading home. That's what I told myself. Just coffee. But the conversations grew deeper. She asked questions Eleanor had stopped asking years ago. Questions about dreams, about regrets, about what kind of life I had imagined when I was younger. Those questions stirred things inside me I hadn't thought about in a long time. One night Margaret said something that changed everything. We were sitting in a booth near the window of the diner. Rain tapped softly against the glass while neon lights flickered across the empty parking lot. She looked at me and said, almost casually, "Do you ever feel like your life chose you instead of the other way around?" I remember staring at my coffee cup for a long moment, because the truth was, I had felt that way before. Marriage, children, responsibility, they arrived one after another until my path felt set in stone. I loved my family, but sometimes I wondered what other lives might have looked like if I had taken different turns. Margaret seemed to understand that feeling without needing it explained. And that understanding became dangerous. The first time she touched my hand, it was brief. We were laughing about something small, and her fingers brushed against mine on the table. Neither of us pulled away right away. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but I remember feeling a rush of heat rise through my chest. Not just attraction, but the thrill of crossing a line I had never crossed before. I knew it was wrong. I knew it the instant it happened. Yet instead of stepping back, I allowed the silence between us to stretch. After that night, everything felt different. Our conversations carried an unspoken tension. Glances lingered longer. Small gestures carried meanings we both understood but never said aloud. And the worst part is, I didn't stop it. Weeks passed. Then one evening in early autumn, the plant scheduled another late shift to finish an urgent order. By the time the work was done, most of the building had emptied out again. Margaret and I were standing near the office doorway, gathering our things. She looked tired, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. For a moment we just stood there, the quiet hum of the building filling the space around us. Then she said softly, "Arthur, do you ever wish you had met someone like me earlier?" It was a dangerous question. and I should have answered it carefully. I stepped closer. I told myself it was just curiosity, just a moment of weakness. But moments have consequences. That night, in a quiet office hallway where no one else could see us, I crossed a line I had sworn I never would. The affair didn't begin with a grand decision. It began with one kiss. And from that moment on, every step I took felt like walking deeper into something I could no longer pretend was harmless. At home, Eleanor continued trusting me completely. She still waited up when I worked late. She still smiled when I walked through the door. And every time I looked into her eyes, a quiet voice inside me whispered the same question. How long could I keep living two lives before one of them finally collapsed? Looking back now, I sometimes wish the affair had ended quickly. A single mistake. One terrible moment that I could regret, confess, and then spend the rest of my life making right. But life rarely unfolds that neatly. What began with one kiss in a quiet office hallway slowly turned into something far more complicated. Weeks became months. Margaret and I found reasons to stay late at work, reasons to meet for coffee, reasons to stretch ordinary moments into something secret. At first, the secrecy itself felt intoxicating. That's the ugly truth. There was a strange excitement in knowing that no one else knew. During the day, I was the same dependable man everyone trusted. The reliable employee, the responsible husband, the father who coached Little League on weekends. But hidden beneath that life was another version of me that existed only in quiet offices and empty diners. For a while, I convinced myself I had everything under control. I told myself Eleanor would never be hurt because she would never know. That kind of thinking is the beginning of self-deception. The guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, usually in the quiet hours when I lay awake beside Eleanor while she slept peacefully. Sometimes she would turn slightly in her sleep and rest her hand against my arm. Even now, after all these years, I remember how heavy that small gesture felt. Because in those moments, the truth about the man I had become sat there beside me in the dark. Margaret, on the other hand, lived in a completely different emotional world. She wasn't married. She didn't have children waiting at home. To her, the affair wasn't a temporary escape. It was something she began to believe could grow into a real future. I should have realized that sooner. But people rarely see consequences clearly when they're in the middle of creating them. The first real crack appeared about a year after everything began. Margaret and I were sitting in her small apartment one evening. That was another line I had crossed without fully acknowledging it. At first we only met outside of work. Then gradually I found myself visiting her place. That night she was quieter than usual. After a long silence, she said something that stopped me cold. "Arthur, how long do you think we can keep doing this?" I knew exactly what she meant. The question had been waiting in the background for months, but neither of us had dared to say it aloud. I tried to deflect the conversation. I said things were complicated, that my children were still young, that leaving my family would destroy everything. All of that was true. But Margaret didn't look angry. She looked sad. "Do you love her?" she asked. The question hung in the room like a weight pressing against my chest. And the honest answer, the answer I didn't want to admit even to myself, was yes. I loved Eleanor. Not in the restless, exciting way Margaret made me feel, but in a deeper, steadier way built from years of shared life. Margaret must have seen the truth in my silence. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. A few weeks later, she told me she was leaving town. She said she had accepted a job in another state. A better opportunity. A fresh start. But we both knew the real reason. She needed a life that didn't revolve around waiting for a man who would never fully belong to her. Our final conversation was strangely calm. There were no dramatic arguments. No accusations. Just two people sitting across from each other, quietly acknowledging that we had walked into something we couldn't sustain. When she left, the affair ended as quietly as it had begun. And outwardly, my life returned to normal. I went home to Eleanor. I went back to being the man everyone believed I was. Years passed. The children grew up and moved away. The factory eventually closed. Eleanor and I grew older together in the same house we had lived in for decades. From the outside, our marriage looked like a success story. And in many ways, it was. But the truth about my betrayal never disappeared. It followed me through every anniversary dinner, every family photograph, every quiet evening when Eleanor would sit beside me on the couch and rest her head gently against my shoulder. Sometimes she would look at me with those same trusting eyes she had when we were young. And each time, a small voice inside me would ask the same question. Does she really know the man she married? I had many chances to tell her the truth over the years. There were moments when the words almost came out. Late at night, on long car rides, during quiet conversations about our life together. But every time, fear stopped me. Not fear of anger. Fear of breaking something pure that had survived so many years. Because Eleanor loved me completely. And that kind of love is a fragile thing once the truth enters the room. Now I am 87 years old. Eleanor sits by the window each morning with her tea, just like she always has. Her hair has turned silver, and her hands tremble slightly when she lifts the cup. But her eyes are still the same. So trusting. Sometimes she smiles at me across the room, and I wonder if she ever suspected anything all those years ago. I honestly don't know. Maybe she did. Maybe love sometimes chooses silence. But here is the truth I have carried for nearly 6 decades. My marriage survived not because I was a perfect husband. It survived because Eleanor was a remarkable woman who loved deeply and lived faithfully. And if there is one lesson my long life has taught me, it is this. The greatest damage we cause in life often comes not from the mistakes themselves, but from the truths we are too afraid to confess.